December 16, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 80,000 German soldiers ignited the darkness at once. Artillery shells tore through frozen trees like paper. American soldiers woke up screaming inside foxholes that collapsed around them. 18-year-old boys from Kansas and Ohio and Georgia were dying before they even understood what was happening. The ground shook for 40 miles in every direction. Flares turned the black sky into a sickly orange theater of carnage. 3 German armies hidden for weeks erupted out of the fog simultaneously across an 80-mile front. It was the largest land battle in American military history, and in the first 6 hours, it looked like the United States Army was being destroyed. But that catastrophe, as devastating as it was not the real crisis. The real crisis was happening somewhere else entirely. Not in the frozen forests where American boys were fighting and dying. The real crisis was building inside a single room at a mahogany desk under the pale winter light of Versailles, France. A general named Dwight Eisenhower was holding a telegram, and he was reading it for the 3rd time, and something in his face had changed. What you are about to hear is the story of the moment the Western Alliance nearly collapsed from the inside. Not because of German tanks, not because of Hitler's gamble, but because one man's arrogance finally pushed the supreme commander of all Allied forces to the absolute edge of what he could endure. And the decision Eisenhower made in that room, in those 5 minutes of silence, would determine whether the war in Europe could even continue under a unified command. This is the story of the day Eisenhower stopped tolerating Bernard Montgomery, and why it took him so long to get there. To understand December 1944, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand what kind of man Eisenhower was and what kind of man he was dealing with. Dwight Eisenhower was not the most brilliant battlefield commander in the American arsenal. George Patton was more aggressive. Omar Bradley was more tactically precise. But Eisenhower possessed something neither of them had. He could hold an alliance together by sheer force of diplomatic will. He could sit in a room with generals from 4 different nations, all of whom believed they were right, and find a path forward that kept everyone fighting in the same direction. This was not weakness. This was perhaps the single most difficult leadership skill in the history of modern warfare. Bernard Montgomery was the opposite problem. The British Field Marshal was indisputably brave. He had stopped Rommel at El Alamein when North Africa hung in the balance. He had planned the Normandy invasion with methodical precision. He was, by any serious military assessment, one of the most capable commanders the British Empire had ever produced. But Montgomery had a flaw so deep, so structural, so fundamental to his personality, that it contaminated everything around him. He believed he was simply better than everyone else. Not just better, categorically superior, and he was incapable of hiding it. When Eisenhower assumed direct command of all Allied ground forces on September 1, 1944, the day France was essentially liberated, Montgomery took it as a personal insult. He had been the ground forces commander during the Normandy invasion. In his mind, in his private hierarchy of military importance, that position belonged to him permanently. The Americans were partners, yes. Necessary partners, absolutely. But junior partners. Partners who needed British experience and British steadiness to compensate for their relative inexperience in European warfare. This belief shaped everything Montgomery did in the autumn of 1944. In September, he pushed aggressively for Operation Market Garden, an audacious airborne assault across the Rhine at Arnhem. He convinced Eisenhower to allocate the majority of Allied fuel and supplies to his thrust, rather than Patton's drive into Germany. The operation was Montgomery's vision, Montgomery's plan, and Montgomery's failure. The paratroopers at Arnhem fought with extraordinary courage. They died in extraordinary numbers. The bridge too far was too far, and the operation collapsed with catastrophic losses. A lesser man might have accepted responsibility and recalibrated. Montgomery kept arguing he had been right. Through October and November, the pattern that would define the relationship repeated itself with grinding regularity. Montgomery would submit documents to Eisenhower claiming that the broad front strategy, Eisenhower's strategy of advancing across the entire Allied line simultaneously, was wrong, wasteful, and doomed. Montgomery would insist that a single narrow thrust under his command was the only path to ending the war in 1944. Montgomery would sometimes explicitly state that Eisenhower lacked the strategic judgment to run the theater effectively. Eisenhower would read these communications. He would respond diplomatically. He would find compromises that addressed Montgomery's concerns without surrendering command authority. He would invite Montgomery to dinners. He would write Montgomery letters designed to smooth the relationship. He would endure. The American generals watching this process were becoming physically ill with resentment. Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group and was responsible for more American soldiers than anyone else in the theater, described Montgomery's attitude as something that burned like acid in his throat. George Patton's language about Montgomery in private correspondence was unprintable in polite company. Even Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder Eisenhower's own British deputy was openly arguing that Montgomery needed to be relieved of command before his arrogance destroyed the alliance from within. Eisenhower held the line. He believed coalition warfare demanded it. He believed the cost of breaking openly with Britain's most celebrated general outweighed the cost of continued accommodation. He absorbed each insult. He managed each crisis. He preserved the appearance of Allied unity and quietly carried the weight of what that unity actually cost. Then, December 16th happened. Von Rundstedt's offensive through the Ardennes was Hitler's last gamble, designed to split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. German forces achieved total tactical surprise. American units on the thinly held Ardennes front were overwhelmed by the initial assault. Communication lines collapsed. Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg lost contact with units north of the German penetration. The situation in the first 48 hours was genuinely dangerous. Eisenhower responded on December 20th with a decision he knew would be painful. He temporarily placed the 1st and 9th American armies under Montgomery's operational control. The tactical logic was unassailable. Montgomery's headquarters was closer to the northern shoulder of the breakthrough. He could restore coordination faster than Bradley could across severed communication lines. It was the right military decision. Bradley understood it was right. He hated it with every fiber of his professional being, but he accepted it. Montgomery's reaction was immediate and revealing. He accepted the temporary command on December 20th, and within hours began behaving as though this arrangement confirmed everything he had always believed about himself. He reorganized American units without consultation. He redirected supply columns that American commanders had positioned. He issued orders that contradicted existing American dispositions in ways that had nothing to do with military necessity and everything to do with establishing dominance. Brigadier General William Keane, recording his commander's reaction, noted that General Hodges of the First Army was white-faced with fury. Montgomery was acting. Hodges told him, like he had just conquered the Americans, not the Germans. But what Montgomery was doing behind the scenes was more dangerous than reorganizing supply columns. He was constructing a narrative. In communications to London, in conversations with British officers, in off-the-record discussions with war correspondents, Montgomery was characterizing the Battle of the Bulge as American failure requiring British rescue. He described American forces as having been caught unprepared through incompetence. He positioned himself as the experienced commander who had arrived to stabilize a situation created by amateur leadership. The reality was almost the opposite. At Sanvith, the 7th Armored Division held against forces 3 times their strength for 6 full days. 6 days of fighting that bought time for the entire Allied response to organize. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, outnumbered, undersupplied, and explicitly ordered by the German commanders to surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe's response became the most famous single word in American military history. These were not failures. These were acts of resistance so fierce they physically broke the momentum of Hitler's final offensive. Montgomery inherited a battle that American soldiers had already turned with their own blood before he gave a single order. Montgomery either did not understand this or chose not to. On January 7, 1945, he held a press conference at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium, that would become one of the most consequential public relations disasters in Allied history. He stood before assembled correspondents for over an hour. He described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. He spoke of how he had employed the whole available power of the British group of armies and seen the picture as a whole. He praised American soldiers as brave fighting men, which sounded generous until you understood the architecture of what surrounded it. The structure of everything he said, the repeated personal pronoun, the framing of British intervention as the decisive factor, the careful positioning of himself as the adult who had managed the situation, all of it combined to deliver one unmistakable message. Montgomery had saved the Americans from themselves. News reached Versailles within hours. Captain Harry Butcher Eisenhower's naval aide wrote in his diary that he had never seen Eisenhower that angry. His face went through colors. Eisenhower said into the air of that room that Montgomery had just claimed credit for the entire operation, while American soldiers were still dying in those forests. And then, even then, Eisenhower chose restraint. He sent Montgomery carefully worded messages suggesting that such public statements might damage Allied unity. He absorbed the fury privately and managed the crisis publicly. Again. But Montgomery was not finished. On December 29, 1944, a telegram arrived at Supreme Headquarters that was different from everything that had come before. Montgomery had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The telegram stated that the current command structure was quite unworkable. It demanded that Eisenhower immediately grant one commander full authority over all ground forces from Switzerland to the North Sea. That commander, though Montgomery did not need to write the name, was obviously himself. And then came the sentence that changed everything. If Eisenhower refused, Montgomery stated he would have no choice but to take his concerns directly to Prime Minister Churchill and the combined Chiefs of Staff, where he was confident British military opinion would support his position. It was not a telegram. It was a coup attempt written in the language of military correspondence. Eisenhower read it once. He read it twice. He read it 3 times. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and stared at the frozen landscape of Versailles for 5 full minutes. The staff officers outside the office moved quietly, sensing something had shifted in the air. When Eisenhower turned back to his desk, the man who had spent 4 months absorbing every insult, managing every crisis, preserving every relationship at cost to himself and everyone around him, that man was gone. What replaced him was something his staff had never seen before. Not anger. Something harder than anger. Something final. He called for his Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, and when Smith arrived, he found Eisenhower already writing. Not a diplomatic response. Not another careful deflection. Something else entirely. Smith read what Eisenhower had drafted and looked up with an expression close to shock. Eisenhower met his gaze and said he had had enough. What happened next in that room in Versailles, in Washington, in London, and in Montgomery's headquarters would determine whether the Western Alliance survived intact or fractured under the weight of one man's ambition. And Montgomery had no idea what was coming. Eisenhower was done absorbing, done deflecting, done carrying the weight of one man's arrogance on behalf of an alliance that was beginning to crack under that weight. He had read Montgomery's telegram 3 times. He had walked to the window. He had stood in silence for 5 minutes. And when he turned back to his desk, something fundamental had changed inside the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe. He called for Walter Bedell Smith. He was already writing. And what he wrote was not diplomacy. But here is what nobody outside that room understood yet. Montgomery's telegram was not the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because now Eisenhower had to fight on 2 fronts simultaneously. He had to confront Montgomery directly, and he had to do it without shattering the political architecture that held the entire Western alliance together. One wrong move, one miscalculation, one message worded too harshly or too softly, and the coalition that had liberated France, that had pushed Germany back to its own borders, could fracture into competing national commands before the final campaign even began. In December 1944, there were more than 3 million Allied soldiers in Western Europe. Their ability to fight as a unified force depended entirely on what happened in the next 72 hours. The margin for error was zero. Smith read Eisenhower's draft response and understood immediately that it could not be sent in its current form. The language was accurate. The anger was justified. But a telegram that openly accused a British field marshal of conducting a military coup attempt would land in London like a grenade. Churchill would be forced to choose publicly between his most celebrated general and the American Supreme Commander. Whatever Churchill decided, the public nature of the confrontation would poison every subsequent Allied operation. Smith told Eisenhower he was right about everything. He told him the draft could not go as written. Eisenhower looked at him and said, "Then tell me what can go." Smith spent the next hour working. He understood that the message needed to accomplish three things simultaneously. It needed to make Eisenhower's position absolutely clear to Washington. It needed to force a decision at the highest political level before Montgomery could mobilize British opinion in his favor. And it needed to be worded in a way that gave Churchill a path to rein in Montgomery without appearing to capitulate to American pressure. This was the diplomatic equivalent of threading a needle in complete darkness while the building burned around you. The telegram that went to General George Marshal in Washington that evening was precise, controlled, and devastating in its implications. Eisenhower outlined Montgomery's demand in full. He explained why granting it was militarily unsound, why it would destroy American confidence in the unified command structure, and why it represented an attempt to change command arrangements through threat rather than through legitimate military argument. And then came the sentence that Smith had helped him craft. Eisenhower stated that this matter had reached the point where it must be decided at the highest level and that he could not continue to function effectively as Supreme Commander unless his authority was clearly established and respected. He was telling Marshal without using the word that he was prepared to resign. Marshal received this telegram late on the evening of December 29th. He read it twice, then picked up the telephone. Within an hour, Admiral Ernest King and General Henry Arnold were in the room with him. Marshal laid out the situation without elaboration. Eisenhower was prepared to force a resolution. Montgomery had issued what amounted to an ultimatum. The Joint Chiefs needed to decide immediately whether they supported their commander, or whether they were willing to let the British dictate the command structure of an operation that was now predominantly American in manpower, logistics, and industrial support. King's response took approximately 4 seconds. He said the United States supported Eisenhower. Period. If the British wanted Montgomery in command of American soldiers, they could fund and supply and equip their own army and run their own war. Arnold agreed without qualification. Marshal drafted his reply to Eisenhower before midnight. The message was the shortest and most powerful communication Eisenhower received during the entire European campaign. Marshal told him he had complete confidence in his judgment that he was in command, that he should make that fact clear to all parties, and that anyone questioning his authority should be referred to Marshal personally. But Marshal understood that telegrams between generals would not resolve this crisis. It required political intervention at the highest level. He called the White House and requested an immediate meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt listened to Marshal's summary without interrupting. When Marshal finished, the president asked one question. He asked whether Eisenhower was the right man. Marshal said yes without hesitation, and explained that the question was not Eisenhower's competence, but Montgomery's willingness to serve under anyone he considered his inferior. Roosevelt's response was direct. Eisenhower stays. Montgomery obeys his orders or he is relieved. Call Churchill tonight and make the American position clear before Montgomery can build political momentum in London. In Downing Street, Churchill received the call in the early hours of December 30th. He was already aware that something serious was developing. British liaison officers at Supreme Headquarters had reported the atmosphere there as explosive. Churchill read Marshal's summary of the situation and then sat quietly for a long moment. His response to his military secretary, recorded verbatim, was this: "Good God! Eisenhower has actually forced the issue. He actually did it." Churchill grasped the magnitude immediately. Britain was no longer the dominant partner in this alliance. In December 1944, American divisions in Western Europe outnumbered British and Canadian divisions combined. American industrial production was supplying fuel, ammunition, and equipment for operations across the entire theater. American logistics infrastructure was the backbone of everything that moved on the continent. If this confrontation became a formal dispute between governments, Britain would lose. Not just the argument. Britain would lose post-war influence, post-war credibility, and potentially the full cooperation of the United States for the final campaigns that would determine the shape of the post-war world. Churchill summoned Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to an emergency meeting in the early morning hours of December 30th. Brooke, who had consistently supported Montgomery throughout the campaign, arrived prepared to argue that his field marshal's tactical assessment was correct, even if his methods were politically clumsy. Churchill did not let him finish. He told Brooke he did not care whether Montgomery was tactically correct. Montgomery had attempted to force a change in command structure by threatening his superior officer with political consequences. That was insubordination. If Britain defended it, they would lose Eisenhower and lose the coherent command of the final campaign into Germany. The political cost was simply too high. Brooke understood. He did not agree, but he understood. Churchill drafted his message to Montgomery that morning with the particular precision of a man who had spent 40 years navigating political crises. It was polite in tone and absolute in content. Montgomery was to withdraw his demands immediately. He was to communicate his full support for Eisenhower's command authority without qualification or reservation. He was to do this before the confrontation became public. Montgomery received Churchill's directive at his headquarters in Zonhoven on the morning of December 30th. His Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guingand, had already assessed the situation with brutal clarity. De Guingand told Montgomery directly that he had miscalculated catastrophically. He had believed the Americans needed him more than he needed them. He was wrong. He had believed Churchill would support him against Eisenhower. He was wrong. He had believed that forcing the issue would result in the command restructuring he wanted. He was wrong about that too. Montgomery had one option remaining. He had to retreat, completely, immediately, without attempting to preserve any element of his original position. The telegram Montgomery sent to Eisenhower on December 30th was one of the most remarkable reversals in the history of military correspondence. A man who had spent 4 months asserting his superiority, demanding additional authority, criticizing American leadership, and threatening political escalation, that man suddenly became almost desperate in his conciliation. Montgomery wrote that he was distressed that Eisenhower had been worried by his previous communication. He declared himself absolutely devoted to Eisenhower's service. He stated he was Eisenhower's most loyal subordinate and would support any command decision without reservation. He wrote that whatever arrangements Eisenhower considered best, Montgomery would accept wholeheartedly and implement immediately. Every demand retracted, every threat dissolved, every claim to superior authority abandoned in a single communication. Eisenhower read it. He showed it to Smith. Neither man said anything for a moment. Then Eisenhower set it down and told Smith to file it. There was no celebration, no satisfaction beyond the grim relief of a crisis resolved. Eisenhower had not wanted to reach this point. He had spent 4 months trying to prevent it, but Montgomery had made it inevitable. On January 1, 1945, Eisenhower issued new command directives that formalized what the confrontation had established. 1st and 9th Armies would return to Bradley's command as soon as tactical conditions permitted. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would continue operations on the northern flank within clearly defined boundaries. And in language that appeared in every subsequent operational order, Eisenhower stated explicitly that he exercised complete and final command authority over all Allied forces in the European theater. His decisions on command matters were not subject to appeal review or political escalation. The era of negotiating with Montgomery was over. Bradley wrote to Eisenhower on January 10th, in terms that were formally military, but personally raw. He thanked Eisenhower for standing firm during the most politically difficult period of the entire campaign. He wrote that Montgomery's behavior during the Battle of the Bulge had been an insult to every American soldier who had bled in those forests, and that Eisenhower's willingness to finally draw an absolute line had meant more to the American command than any tactical decision of the preceding months. What the episode revealed about Eisenhower was something his critics had consistently missed. They had labeled him too political, too accommodating, too focused on coalition harmony at the expense of clear military decision-making. They had seen his patience with Montgomery as weakness. December 29th demonstrated that they had fundamentally misread him. Eisenhower had been patient not because he lacked the will to act, but because he had calculated correctly that premature confrontation would cost more than it resolved. When the moment came that accommodation was no longer possible, he acted with the kind of decisive finality that left no room for misinterpretation. Montgomery had found the line. He had simply not understood it was there until he crossed it. The command relationship between the two men never recovered its earlier surface warmth. Their meetings became formal, brief, and transactional. Eisenhower no longer invited Montgomery to dinner. He no longer wrote the personal letters designed to smooth the relationship. They coordinated operations because the war required it. They attended the same planning sessions because unified command demanded it. But the pretense of partnership between equals was gone. And in its absence, the Western alliance became something more honest and therefore more functional than it had ever been. Command authority was established. Everyone from London to Washington to the forward headquarters in Belgium understood who gave orders and who obeyed them. But clarity in command structure does not resolve a war. The Germans were still fighting. The Rhine had not been crossed. And Montgomery, humiliated, but still in command of the northern flank, was about to face the most complex river-crossing operation in European military history. The question was whether a man who had just been publicly broken would have the professional discipline to execute it with the forces Eisenhower gave him, or whether the resentment burning inside 21st Army Group headquarters would find a new and more dangerous expression when the stakes became even higher. The answer would come at the Rhine, and it would surprise everyone. By the first week of January 1945, the Western Alliance had survived its most dangerous internal crisis. Eisenhower had drawn his line. Montgomery had retreated. Washington had spoken with absolute clarity. The command structure that would carry 3 million Allied soldiers into Germany was intact. The confrontation that nearly shattered the coalition from the inside had been resolved in 72 hours of telegrams, telephone calls, and one prime minister telling his most celebrated general to stand down. But the Germans were still fighting, and they had been watching everything. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had been monitoring Allied command communications with sophisticated interception capabilities throughout the winter campaign. They could not read encrypted traffic directly, but patterns in communication volume, in the movement of liaison officers, in the sudden shift of supply priorities between 21st Army Group and 12th Army Group told their analysts a story. Something significant had changed inside Supreme Headquarters. The Americans and British had experienced a rupture serious enough to alter operational dispositions across the entire Northern Front. German planners at OB West, the Western Command Headquarters, spent 3 days analyzing the pattern shift and concluded that Allied operations in the North would be delayed while the command structure was reorganized. They were partially right, and they planned accordingly. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B in the Ardennes, received intelligence summaries suggesting that Montgomery's assumption of command over 1st and 9th Armies had created friction that would slow the Allied counteroffensive. Model recommended to OKW Hitler's high command that German forces use this window to consolidate defensive positions along the Our River and the Siegfried Line before the inevitable Allied push resumed. Hitler approved. German engineers worked through January nights, reinforcing positions, laying additional minefields, registering artillery on approach routes that American units would have to use when they finally moved. The assumption inside OB West was that Allied command confusion had bought Germany at least 3 additional weeks. They had underestimated Eisenhower's ability to restore operational momentum the moment the political crisis was resolved. On January 3, 1945, 3 days after Montgomery's humiliating reversal, the Allied counteroffensive in the Ardennes resumed with coordinated force from both the northern and southern shoulders of the German penetration simultaneously. First Army attacked south from Malmedy. Patton's Third Army drove north from Bastogne. The Germans had anticipated this, but they had not anticipated the speed. The pause they expected to exploit simply did not materialize. Eisenhower had resolved the command crisis and returned to operational planning within hours. The German intelligence estimate of a 3-week delay collapsed into a 3-day window that accomplished almost nothing. By January 16th, American forces from north and south linked up at Houffalize, closing the Ardennes pocket. The German offensive that had shocked the world on December 16th was officially broken. German losses in the Battle of the Bulge totaled approximately 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, along with 800 tanks and assault guns and 1,000 aircraft. American losses were severe, roughly 75,000 casualties, but the United States possessed the industrial and manpower capacity to replace those losses. Germany did not. The Ardennes offensive had been Hitler's last strategic reserve. He had spent it, and it had failed. But here is what the casualty numbers did not capture. The battle had also cost Germany something less quantifiable and more devastating than tanks or divisions. It had cost them time. They could not recover fuel, they could not replace, and the initiative they would never regain. From January 1945 onward, German forces in the West were fighting a delaying action against an Allied army that now moved with unified purpose under a command structure that had been tested, challenged, and confirmed. Inside Supreme Headquarters, the change in atmosphere was immediate and observable. Brigadier General Arthur Nevins, working in operations, later wrote that before December 29th, planning sessions carried an undercurrent of tension related to whether Montgomery would comply with directives or contest them through political back channels. After January 1st, that undercurrent was gone. Directives went out. Units executed them. The machinery of coalition warfare operated as it was designed to operate without the friction that one man's ambition had introduced into every level of planning. Bradley noticed it first in the daily operations meetings. He told his aide that for the first time since Normandy, he walked into Supreme Headquarters, planning sessions, without wondering whether Montgomery had already privately lobbied Eisenhower to modify the agenda. The meetings became shorter. Decisions stuck. Resources moved where operational necessity demanded, rather than where political pressure redirected them. Patton noticed it differently. He wrote in his diary on January 12th that Eisenhower seemed to have shed something heavy. He did not know what had happened in Versailles on December 29th, not the full picture. But he wrote that Ike moved differently, like a man who had finally put down a weight he had been carrying for months. Montgomery noticed it most of all, though he recorded nothing publicly about his internal reaction. The operational directives he received in January were precise, specific, and accompanied by resource allocations that were firm rather than negotiable. When 21st Army Group submitted requests for additional bridging equipment and engineering support for the Rhine crossing operation, the response from Supreme Headquarters was a detailed breakdown of what would be available and when, with no invitation for further discussion of the underlying allocation decisions. This was new. Previously, such requests had opened extended negotiations. Now they produced answers. Montgomery implemented the directives without comment. The Rhine crossing operation, codenamed Plunder, required preparation on a scale that dwarfed even the Normandy invasion in certain engineering dimensions. The Rhine at the crossing points was between 300 and 500 yards wide, running fast with winter current with defended banks on the eastern shore that German forces had been fortifying since the fall of 1944. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would cross on the night of March 23, 1945, supported by the largest airborne operation since Market Garden, codenamed Varsity, involving 16,000 paratroopers dropped simultaneously east of the Rhine to seal off German reinforcement routes. Eisenhower approved the operational plan on February 10th. He allocated the engineering resources, the air support, and the logistics infrastructure that Montgomery had requested without the negotiation that had characterized every previous major resource discussion. He did this not because he had forgiven Montgomery or forgotten December 29th, but because Operation Plunder was militarily sound, and the northern crossing was strategically essential to encircling the Ruhr industrial region. Command authority and operational cooperation were not the same thing. Eisenhower had demonstrated he could enforce the former while maintaining the latter. On March 7, 1945, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing. German engineers had failed to destroy it in time. First Army commanders made a decision in minutes without waiting for authorization from higher command and seized the bridge, immediately pushing armor across before German forces could react. Within 24 hours, American engineers were constructing additional pontoon bridges, and a bridgehead 3 miles deep had been established on the eastern bank. The Rhine had been crossed, not by Montgomery's meticulously planned and heavily resourced northern operation, by American soldiers moving fast on an unexpected opportunity. When the news reached Versailles, Eisenhower's reaction captured everything essential about how his command philosophy had evolved. He immediately ordered Bradley to exploit the Remagen bridgehead, aggressively expanding it before German forces could concentrate to eliminate it. He did not pause to consult with Montgomery about whether this changed the operational priorities of Plunder. He acted on military opportunity with the directness that had been constrained for months by the need to manage competing national sensitivities. Bradley received Eisenhower's call authorizing maximum exploitation of the Remagen crossing at 3 p.m. on March 7th. He later wrote that Eisenhower's voice on that call was different from anything he had heard from him in months. No qualification, no balancing of political concerns. Just a commander recognizing an opportunity and ordering it taken. Montgomery's Plunder operation proceeded on March 23rd as planned. The crossing was successful. The airborne drop of Varsity went more smoothly than Market Garden, with paratroopers landing on their objectives and linking up with ground forces within hours rather than days. By March 25th, 21st Army Group had established a bridgehead 25 miles wide and 6 miles deep on the eastern bank of the Rhine. German resistance, though fierce in isolated pockets, lacked the coordination to mount effective counterattacks against the scale of force Montgomery had assembled. The crossing was a military success. It was also, in the context of everything that had preceded it, something Montgomery had badly needed. He had been humiliated in December. He had executed his directives in January and February without the latitude to demonstrate independent strategic vision. Plunder gave him a genuine operational achievement to point to a crossing that had been planned with his characteristic thoroughness and executed with the engineering precision that represented the best of British military professionalism. Eisenhower acknowledged it publicly. He sent Montgomery a personal message on March 26th commending 21st Army Group on the execution of Plunder and Varsity. The message was formal. It was also genuine. Eisenhower had never doubted Montgomery's operational competence. What he had doubted, and what December had confirmed, was Montgomery's ability to subordinate his own ambition to the requirements of unified command. The Rhine crossing demonstrated that Montgomery could still perform when performing was what the situation required. But the world had changed around Montgomery while he was learning this lesson. By late March 1945, German resistance west of the Rhine had effectively collapsed. American forces were encircling the Ruhr from both north and south, trapping Army Group B in a pocket that would ultimately yield 325,000 German prisoners, the largest surrender of Axis forces in the entire Western European campaign. Patton was driving east toward Czechoslovakia at speeds that made even his previous advances look cautious. Simpson's Ninth Army reached the Elbe River on April 11th and stopped per Eisenhower's directive to allow Soviet forces to complete the capture of Berlin. Montgomery's role in these final weeks was important, but not decisive. He pushed northeast toward Hamburg and the Baltic, cutting off German forces in Denmark and preventing their escape. It was necessary work. It was not the central axis of the final campaign. That distinction belonged to Bradley's 12th Army Group, operating in the center, with the weight of American industrial and manpower capacity behind it. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. German armed forces surrendered unconditionally. The ceremony was held at Supreme Headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower was present. Montgomery signed the surrender documents for the German forces in the north at Lüneburg Heath on May 4th. Both men participated in the final act of the European war that they had fought together in ways that were sometimes cooperative and sometimes openly antagonistic for 11 months. They stood in different rooms at different ceremonies, which was perhaps an accurate reflection of how the alliance had actually functioned. What the story of Eisenhower and Montgomery reveals about leadership, about coalition warfare, about the price of ambition, and the necessity of authority, those lessons did not end with the German surrender. They had been written into the structure of every military alliance that came after. And the man at the center of it all, the general who had absorbed 4 months of insults and then acted with complete decisiveness when the moment demanded it, that man's understanding of why patience and firmness must coexist in the same commander, is a story that deserves one final chapter. Because what Eisenhower did after the war, and what it cost him, and what it produced, is the part of this story that almost nobody tells. And it begins with a question nobody thought to ask in the celebration of May 1945. When Eisenhower finally stopped tolerating Montgomery, what exactly did he choose to protect? It was not his pride. It was not his career. It was something he believed was worth more than either of those things. What that was, and whether history proved him right, is what Part 4 is about. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang across liberated cities. Soldiers wept in the streets of Paris and Brussels and Amsterdam. 3 years, 8 months, and 8 days. After America entered the war, Germany surrendered unconditionally in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, while Dwight Eisenhower waited in an adjacent room, declining to be present for the ceremony itself, because he believed the moment belonged to the soldiers, who had fought, not the commanders who had directed them. That gesture told you everything about the man. But here is the question that the celebrations of May 1945 buried under flags and parades, and the genuine relief of a world stepping back from catastrophe. What happened to the men who had actually shaped the final campaign? What happened to Eisenhower, who had carried the impossible weight of coalition command for 11 months and nearly broken under it? What happened to Montgomery, who had reached the peak of his professional life and then been publicly broken by the man he had underestimated? And what did the confrontation of December 29, 1944, actually mean, not just for the war, but for every alliance and every command structure that came after it? Because this story has a final chapter. And it is not the one anyone expected. Eisenhower returned to the United States in June 1945 as the most celebrated military figure in American history since Grant. The reception in Washington and New York was extraordinary in scale. Millions of people lined streets. The applause was genuine and overwhelming. But Eisenhower characteristically seemed more uncomfortable with the celebration than energized by it. He told his aide Harry Butcher that he kept thinking about the soldiers who were not coming home, the ones for whom there would be no parade. He served briefly as Army Chief of Staff, then as the first Supreme Commander of NATO, then made the decision that surprised almost no one who had watched him operate for a decade. He ran for president. He won in 1952 by one of the largest electoral margins in American history, carrying states that Republicans had not won in a generation. He served 2 terms. He presided over the most sustained period of American prosperity in the 20th century. He kept the country out of major war for 8 years, despite intense pressure from military advisors and political hawks who believed that American power should be used more aggressively in Korea, in Indochina, in the Taiwan Strait. His farewell address in January 1961 contained one of the most prescient warnings any American president has ever delivered. He cautioned the country against the undue influence of what he called the military-industrial complex, the interlocking network of defense contractors, military bureaucracy, and political interests that he had watched grow throughout his years in command and in office. The general who had commanded the largest military force in Western history was warning his country that its own military establishment might, if left unchecked, begin making decisions that served institutional interests rather than national ones. He had seen it happen. He had fought it in a mahogany office in Versailles in December 1944. He recognized the pattern. Montgomery's trajectory moved in the opposite direction, which is perhaps the most instructive element of the entire story. He was promoted to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the British Army, in September 1944, a promotion that preceded his December humiliation by 3 months, and that he could not be stripped of. He served as Chief of the Imperial General Staff from 1946 to 1948, the professional head of the British Army, where his administrative gifts proved more useful than they had in coalition command. He then served as Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO from 1951 to 1958, working under American Supreme Commanders for 7 years, an arrangement that required him to practice precisely the subordination he had been incapable of in 1944. He wrote his memoirs in 1958. In them, he repeated almost every argument he had made to Eisenhower in real time. He maintained that the broad front strategy was wrong. He maintained that a single thrust under his command would have ended the war in 1944. He maintained that the Battle of the Bulge had been an American failure, requiring British rescue. He softened none of it. He walked back none of it. The man who had sent the desperate conciliatory telegram of December 30th, walking back every demand in language that bordered on pleading, wrote his memoirs as though that telegram had never been sent. Eisenhower, who had maintained public courtesy toward Montgomery for the 14 years since the war, read the memoirs and ended the relationship permanently. He wrote privately to Bradley that he was done pretending. Montgomery had spent his entire post-war career rewriting a history that the participants all knew was false. Eisenhower had no further obligation to protect a man who refused even in retrospect to understand what had nearly happened in December 1944. Bradley was less restrained in his own memoirs. He called Montgomery the most difficult man he had ever worked with in a professional capacity, and stated that the decision Eisenhower made on December 29, 1944, was the single most important command decision of the entire European campaign, more important than any tactical choice about where to cross the Rhine or how to handle the Ardennes breakthrough. Because without it, the alliance itself might have fractured before the final campaign began. The lesson embedded in that judgment is the one that military historians and leadership theorists have returned to repeatedly in the 8 decades since the war ended. Coalition warfare is perhaps the most complex form of human organization ever devised. It requires nations with different histories, different military traditions, different political pressures, and different strategic interests to operate under unified command, as though those differences do not exist. The entire construct depends on something that cannot be written into any treaty or directive. It depends on trust. Trust that the commander exercising authority over your soldiers is making decisions based on military necessity and shared objectives rather than national advantage. Trust that the command structure will protect all partners, not just the most powerful one. Montgomery's fundamental error, the one that made December 29th inevitable, was not tactical. It was not even primarily political. It was a failure to understand what the alliance actually was. He had treated it as an arrangement in which British experience and British prestige entitled Britain to disproportionate authority over a force that was predominantly American in every measurable dimension. He had treated Eisenhower's patience as evidence of weakness, rather than as evidence of a man carrying an extraordinary burden with extraordinary discipline. And when he finally pushed past the limit of what that discipline could absorb, he discovered that the patience had not been weakness at all. The principle Eisenhower established in those 72 hours of December 1944 became the structural foundation of NATO, which was formed in 1949 and which has operated under American Supreme Commanders ever since. The command structure Eisenhower defended that the Supreme Commander exercises genuine authority regardless of national origin, that political pressure cannot override military necessity, that accommodating a subordinate's ambitions at the expense of unified command is itself a form of strategic failure. Those principles were written directly into the NATO Charter and into the doctrines of every major military alliance that followed. When American forces operated alongside British and French forces in Korea, when NATO coordinated responses to Soviet pressure throughout the Cold War, when coalition forces assembled under American command for the Gulf War in 1991, and the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, and the campaign in Afghanistan after 2001, every one of those operations relied on a command framework that Eisenhower had paid for personally in the winter of 1944. He had paid for it in absorbed insults and managed crises, and 5 minutes of silence at a winter window before he finally acted. There is a detail about the December 29th telegram that most accounts of this episode do not include. It was discovered in the Eisenhower Presidential Library archives during a declassification review in the 1980s. Among Eisenhower's personal papers from December 1944 is a single handwritten note, undated, that appears to have been written sometime in the week before Montgomery's ultimatum arrived. The note is not addressed to anyone. It reads in Eisenhower's handwriting that he had been wondering whether he had been too patient, whether the kindness he thought he was showing to the alliance was actually a disservice to the soldiers who depended on clear command, whether tolerance taken past its productive limit becomes its own form of failure. He had been thinking about this before Montgomery forced the issue. He had been approaching his own limit independently, through private reflection, before the telegram made it unavoidable. The crisis of December 29th did not create Eisenhower's decision. It simply made the decision undeferrable. That handwritten note suggests something about leadership that the formal historical record tends to obscure. The great decisions, the ones that change the direction of wars and alliances and institutions, rarely arrive as sudden revelations. They accumulate. They form through months of carrying weight that most people never see, through private doubt and private reckoning, through the gradual recognition that the cost of continued accommodation has finally exceeded the cost of decisive action. Eisenhower did not become capable of December 29th on December 29th. He became capable of it through every prior incident he had managed, every insult he had absorbed, every night he had spent working out in his own mind exactly where the line was and what he would do when someone crossed it. The military-industrial complex speech, the NATO command structure, the handwritten note in the archives, these are not separate stories. They are the same story told across different decades. A man who understood that authority, without the willingness to enforce it, is not authority at all. A man who understood that patience is a strategic asset up to a precise point, and that past that point, it becomes a strategic liability. A man who understood that the most important thing he could do for the 3 million soldiers under his command was not to make every general happy, but to make certain that every general understood who gave the orders. From a Kansas farm town, through West Point, through the political labyrinth of coalition warfare, Dwight Eisenhower built and defended a command structure that held 3 nations together through the most complex military operation in Western history. In the final 4 months of the European War, that structure produced results that would have been impossible under the fragmented nationally competitive arrangement Montgomery had been working to create. The Ruhr encirclement captured 325,000 German soldiers. The Rhine crossings succeeded across multiple points simultaneously. Germany surrendered in May, rather than dragging the war into a brutal urban campaign that military planners had estimated might cost another 100,000 Allied casualties. Those lives were saved, at least in part, because on December 29, 1944, one man read a telegram 3 times, stood at a winter window for 5 minutes, and then sat back down and wrote something that he had been preparing to write without fully knowing it for 4 months. The day Eisenhower stopped tolerating Montgomery was the day he proved that the most important act of leadership is sometimes not a battlefield decision or a strategic plan. Sometimes it is simply the willingness to say clearly and without compromise that this is where the line is, and this is what happens when you cross it. If you know another story from this war, another moment where one decision changed everything, put it in the comments. There are hundreds of them, and every one deserves to be told, because history is not made by the famous or the powerful alone. It is made in telegrams and winter windows and 5 minutes of silence before a man sits back down and decides that enough is enough. Subscribe, because we are just getting started.